Okay, guys. All right, let's do this. So you will have a preview about the DBQ test at the end of this, but you won't be able to fast forward it. So you're gonna have to bear with me here. Okay, a few last things about um, the Industrial Revolution. Okay, just to consolidate it. In terms of the Manchester School, remember we talked about Malthus and Ricardo and economic liberalism, and we talked about liberalism in general, but and the important thing to note about Malthus and Ricardo and the Manchester School is that they're arguing that the economy operates on these natural laws, right? That it's kind of an offshoot of the Enlightenment. We know that natural law, but they're arguing that the economy has natural law to it, that it's self-regulating and fundamentally separate from politics. Okay, that's what they're arguing, and it's an extension of Adam Smith saying that if everybody goes after their own self-interest, everybody's going to benefit. So the enhanced general welfare would be the result of all people if they followed their enlightened self-interest. So if business, if charity, business, charity, education remains in private hands and the government doesn't interfere, it's like anti-government interference in all capacity. They want to abolish tariffs and promote free trade. And of course, workers only need to earn enough to survive, like the subsistence wages, the iron law of wages. Now, remember also that when people start to congregate and become congregate in these cities, and cities start to become more dense, the rural areas become more dense, density increases in general. Palmer has this great line, and it's somewhere in chapter 11, but it has to do with the concentration of people led to the improvement of their condition, which I think it's on 443. Okay, so he talks about kind of the potential benefits of urbanization in light of all the other bad social stuff that happens. But he says, this is on the top of 443, the concentration of working people in city and factory opened the way to improvement in their condition. It made their misery apparent. Philanthropic sentiment gradually arose among the more fortunate. Gathered in cities, workers obtained more knowledge of the world. So they talking to each other, mingling and talking together. They developed a sense of solidarity, class interest, and common political aims, and in time they became organized, establishing labor unions by which to obtain a larger share of the national income. This is very, very important. This urbanization leads to class consciousness, class solidarity, and will lead to the formation of labor unions and the potential for workers to collectively bargain with their employers. Okay, so that's a very, very important thing to remember. Also, the things that we need to consider is that places like Manchester, remember, politically, were organized still as kind of manor towns and not legally cities. They don't have legal status at cities, so this makes not only the logistics of running a city, like how do you get water and safety and all that stuff, but how do you represent that city in Parliament? We're going to run into problems there. Okay, so on to all the isms. I want to kind of maybe perhaps go into. We talked about liberalism a fair amount. I want to talk about Romanticism, radicalism, and republicanism a bit more, socialism, especially feminism. So bear with me here. Okay, perhaps a little utilitarianism too. Okay, so let's move on to Romanticism, and I will kind of give you guys a little bit of a taste of romantic art. This is one of my all-time favorite paintings by David Caspar Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea Fog. And I'm just going to talk about Romanticism for a second here. It's a reaction against the Enlightenment and against the Industrial Revolution. And remember the context of the time period around the turn of the century, right? Like 1800 and in reaction to Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, there are severe reactionary forces, meaning like conservative forces that want to stem the tide of the French Revolution and of Napoleon and the Romantic period, the Romantic era is a part of that, right? As people are losing their connection to nature, right, and becoming fortunately or not, becoming more industrialized and urbanized. Romantics long for this in a way. So it's a reaction against the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and it's part of this conservative kind of reactionary reaction politically that the Congress of Vienna displays, that all the leaders like Metternich and Alexander I and Castlereagh from England and Talleyrand from France, all these great powers that are trying to hold on to an old way of dealing with the masses, of holding on to power as forces conspire against them. Nationalist forces, forces of independence, forces from the working class, and so on. But Romanticism is complicated. There's no one definition, right? So I'm going to list several things here. So it championed the individual, as we see here, of this individual who's obviously risen above the fog and is looking down over to survey everything that he sees. We don't know whether he's come from this and he's looking back, or whether he's come from this way and he's looking at what he still has to go through, but I think that's one of the beauties of the painting. Hegel, in terms of championing the individual, called Romanticism an idea of looking inward. He's called it absolute inwardness. So to be absolutely inward, to like focus on yourself, and a glorification of the self and focusing on the self. And we will see how certain artists take this to kind of a hedonistic extreme. Let's see, emphasis on the artist over his work. This is important, right? Previously, the work was celebrated and not so much the artist necessarily, but Romantics, they've emphasis on the artist over his work, so the subjective experience of the artist. Another theme is the heroism of the individual. You see that here. You see some of it in some of the paintings that glorify like some of the nationalist movements. Another one is the inability to understand the world through reason alone. We know that from Kant and Rousseau, the idea that pure reason is not enough. Emphasis on imagination and feeling. Okay, we know that. They tried not to seek to control nature, as what was happening in the industrialization and through the scientific revolution. One of the themes is like, we can know how nature works and we can therefore control it. They don't want to necessarily control nature, they want to be awed by it. Another theme is the revival of Christianity, especially with Methodism in England. Usually Romantics glorify medieval times as opposed to classical times or the Renaissance era. They are glorifying medieval times, both in architecture, like Gothic architecture, and the kind of chivalry and nature and medieval kind of superstition, if you will, folklore, folk songs, fairy tales, and also this kind of weird world beyond that of the basic empirical human experience, namely dreams, hallucinations, sleepwalking, stuff like that. And as we'll see in some extreme cases, or maybe not so extreme cases because it was pretty widespread, drug use. Drug use in order to try and find a world beyond that of the ordinary senses, trying to augment the senses and achieve a different kind of reality. But all these artists shared an alienation. They were experiencing, they were trying to reject this new modernity, right? They were experiencing alienation. And so they considered life to be changing too much, right? The cold rationalism of the Enlightenment and progress and the scientific revolution had wrought the Industrial Revolution, and the old political order was collapsing, and the aristocracy was disappearing slowly but surely. And so this led them to question the supremacy of reason, right? So the intellectual roots, we know that this is coming from Rousseau and Kant, right? So we know all about Rousseau and his like kind of embracing of talking about human nature and is human nature should nature be human nature's teacher, right? Because society is artificial, right? Because he concluded that society is artificial, we need to kind of get back to being closer to nature. But Kant is important here. In the 1780s, he's talking and he's writing, and he says, kind of in a very Descartes kind of way, that the mind actively imposes on the world a sensory experience, the categories of understanding. So he says the mind itself generates these categories, basically saying that human perception is a product of the mind's own activity and sensory experience. What does this mean? This means that humans have an innate sense of moral duty or an awareness of the what he called the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative, that there's this what he called a noumenal world, Noumenal, a sphere of moral and aesthetic reality known by practical reason and conscience. So this is an innate sense of moral duty or an awareness of the categorical imperative, meaning an inner command, that humans have an inner command to act in every situation as one would have all other people always act in the same situation. So, for example, if you see someone get hurt, you run to them or do you run away, right? You see someone get hurt, hopefully you would run to them because that's what you would want them to do in the same situation if it happened to you, right? So the kind of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? So that Kant thinks that everybody has this innate sense of moral duty in the categorical imperative, that humankind has a moral sense. So therefore he concludes that that reason alone cannot disprove God, eternal life, future rewards and punishments, or the fact that humans are kind of born with this, moral duty. So that counteracts Lockean liberalism and like Lockean the tabula rasa, like the blank slate, right? So he mixes intuition and feeling with Enlightenment rationalism to kind of create a better mixture there. Romantic literature, in general, did not observe classical forms. They were free to play with the imagination. In England, it's Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth and the lyrical ballads. So Coleridge believed that imagination was God at work in the human mind. So if imagination was God's work in the human mind, then poetry and things like of this nature were not just idle play. These were the highest forms of human action because they were expressing the imagination. So he wrote Gothic poems of the supernatural, most notably the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, talking about the killing of the sailor killing the albatross, and then he's cursed by wearing the albatross around the neck because killing the albatross is a crime against nature and a crime against God. And Wordsworth is talking about, he writes the lyrical ballads, and notably the Ode on Intimations of Immortality in 1803, which mourns the loss of his childhood view of nature. And this is a romantic theme, like childhood is celebrated and mourned for, that we see the world as children with these amazing open eyes, and that we lose that over time, and he mourns that. And this coincides with a romantic obsession with and longing for the past. Another notable romantic is, let's go to, this is Robert Owen, Lord Byron. We can do a little Lord Byron. There he is. George Gordon Byron. Lord Byron, 1788 to 1824. A true rebel. Even other romantic writers didn't like him. But outside of England, he's regarded as a true embodiment of the French Revolution. He rejected old traditions. He divorced his wife and was famous for having affairs. He embraced personal liberty and was very skeptical and kind of mocked everything. Notably, Don Juan writes filled with kind of mocking humor and kind of lowbrow humor, if you will. And he was big in the Greek independence movement, which happens in the 1820s. And Greece basically gets its independence from the Ottoman Empire. And he dies of a fever while fighting alongside the Greeks against the Ottomans. And this will coincide with another theme of Romanticism, which is this kind of fascination with yet perversion of Islam, and like kind of a rejuvenation of ancient medieval kind of crusade-like mentality towards Islam. So he also loved dogs, by the way. That was just like a interesting example. His dog, Boatswain, actually has a tomb that's larger than he is, than his tomb. Another one is, of course, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, right? So let's go to Mary Shelley. There she is. Okay. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818. She's the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. William Godwin was one of England's first radicals. Lived in the 1780s and 1790s, turn of the century. And some argue that he's the first anarchist. That's William Godwin, Mary Shelley's dad. Some also argue that he's the kind of prototypical utilitarian in terms of utilitarianism, celebrated also by Jeremy Bentham, this guy, utilitarianism. So William Godwin and Jeremy Bentham are kind of like the first utilitarians. And Mary Wollstonecraft, you should know from The Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the first feminists who writes that in, I think, 1790 or 1791. So Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin get together and have a baby, and that's Mary Shelley. But going back to utilitarianism for a second, I found a quote about utilitarianism that says, utilitarianism is an action that believes, a utilitarian kind of believes, that an action is right if it tends to promote happiness and wrong if it tends to produce the reverse of happiness. And this is for the whole population, not necessarily individuals. Right, but like, what is the utility of a political policy if it makes a whole bunch of your population unhappy? Okay, so not just the happiness of the performer of the action, but also that of everyone affected by it. So this is a key point in utilitarianism, and will be later championed by someone very important who we'll get to eventually, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is also a big feminist. And so this kind of theory that an action is right if it tends to promote happiness, and not just the happiness of the performer, but also that of everyone affected by it, such a theory is in opposition to egoism, selfishness, even you could argue liberalism, right, as we know it in AP Euro, the view that that a person should pursue his own self-interest even at the expense of others, right? So we can see how utilitarianism might be a precursor to social democracy, socialism. That's a good working definition of utilitarianism. So back to Mary Godwin Shelley. She's 16 years old. She falls in love with this guy Percy Shelley, who's already married. This creates a scandal. She flees England to avoid the scandal, but Shelley's wife kills herself. So Mary Godwin marries Percy Shelley soon thereafter. They go to Geneva. They go to Lake Geneva, and that's where she writes Frankenstein. Frankenstein is called the modern Prometheus, right? In Greek mythology, Prometheus brought fire to mankind. So I don't know what kind of like connections we can make to that, but I'll leave that up to you. Moving on to German writers, we've got Goethe. So the way they pronounce that is this way. Whoops. Goethe. Right. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Let's see. I'll just click on him there. His big work is Faust in 1808. Faust makes a pact with the devil. The pact with the devil is that he exchanges his soul for greater knowledge more than any other human has, and it's an allegory for the will to power. It's like, like if you have more knowledge, then you can kind of outsmart everybody. You can create more commodities or innovate, right? And you can have more knowledge, like you have more power than everybody else. But this power corrupts him, of course. Yeah, he uses his power for nefarious means. He seduces this woman, Gretchen, this young woman, but she dies tragically, and then he realizes what this power has done to him, and he dedicates his life to improving the plight of all of humankind, kind of a utilitarian kind of mindset. And this breaks the pact with the devil. So the Faust is this big allegory for power, the quest for power, and then what kind of evils that searches for, kind of like Frankenstein in a way. If you think about power, what kind of power it takes to create a human being out of dead bodies. Okay, so Romantic art. We're gonna do a whole art project about this, but the key is that the Middle Ages, they take this kind of like, they view nature, they view the supernatural. I'll go back to not that. I will go back to this. Obviously, nature, the individual, heroism. Also, nationalism becomes a part of Romantic art. They champion the sublime. We'll go into that at a later date. The other things, in terms of the triumph of Romanticism, okay, because there's lots and lots of Romantic art. But religion, revitalization of religion, I mentioned Methodism. You also have a kind of celebration of Catholicism. And this guy, Chateaubriand, okay, he writes The Genius of Christianity in 1802. And this becomes the Bible of Romanticism. He argues that the essence of religion is passion, the foundation of faith in the church was the emotion that its teachings and sacraments inspired in the heart of the Christian, right? So lots of people use this, even Catholicism, and there's a strong Catholic reaction against the secularism of the French Revolution and of Napoleon and of his reforms. Okay, we all remember what Napoleon said. Like, I'm a Muslim in Egypt, and I'm a Anglican in England. Whatever he said. So, Chateaubriand and Methodism. Methodism is John Wesley. Okay, John Wesley is the Methodism guy. So we already talked about Fichte and Herder in terms of nationalism, because that's another big thing. Romantic nationalism. Okay, in Europe. So you can kind of look at that types of nationalism, but form of nationalism, which this might be interesting, but you can go search for that on your own time. But we know that Fichte and Herder in Germany, and then the other big one is Hegel in Germany. Okay, so the Hegelian dialectic. Okay, so the Hegelian dialectic. I'll just write it up here just so you can see. Hegelian dialectic. Okay, that's how you say it. That's how you. Anyway, that's in your reading. Anyway, but the idea, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is a way of seeing history progress. Okay. He says that any one given time, right, a dominant set of ideas in terms of the thesis, brings about an antithesis. So, say, for example, in religion, the thesis being a dominant set of ideas, Catholicism, brought about over time an antithesis, meaning Protestantism. And then through their battles, through those wars, through those battles of ideas and on the battlefield, we created a synthesis. So what is the synthesis, you might ask? Well, we can maybe say that it's secularism, that it's religious toleration, but even over time, religious toleration and secularism, which becomes the dominant set of ideas, it has its own antithesis. So in this time period that we're talking about, if you take secularism from the French Revolution as a dominant set of ideas and you create an antithesis, the antithesis is the reaction, the conservative reaction, like a romantic period, right? So you start to see how this becomes a way to see history as a clash of ideas, and you can even say that the thesis, the dominant set of ideas today, could be Western culture, and then the antithesis becomes religious Islamic fundamentalism, and then through those kind of battles that that are going on right now, we're going to have a new synthesis of ideas. Hegel's big work is the Phenomenology of Mind, which is 1806. Okay, so all this stuff is happening, and in terms of Islam, how Romanticism relates to Islam. I mean, this is painting by Jean Gros, Gros. It's called The Battle of Abu Qir in 1799. Romanticism, and when Napoleon goes to Egypt, right? He reinvigorates ideas of conquering the Middle East. Okay, and this plays into our world today. I mean, like, this is the start of the mingling of, and the mingling of Europe and the Middle East, and the meddling in the Middle East by Europe. Okay, so you have Napoleon here on his white horse, right, with the big sword, and you have the angry-looking Islamic guy, right? I mean, this is what we call Orientalism. Okay, and lots of people, after Napoleon goes to the Middle East, lots of people start to go there and write travelogues and stories and books about their experiences over there, and they come back, and the travelogues are obviously very prejudiced and very kind of like, oh my God, these people are backwards, these people are crazy. But the medieval crusades against Islam fired the Romantic imagination, so that's how it kind of ties into Romanticism. And so they start actually to see many countries and many people start to see, especially the Ottoman Empire, as again a threat to decency all over the world, and especially Russia, like Alexander the First. Russia, as we know, always wants Constantinople. It wants that area of the world, right? If we see, let's go here. If we go back to, these are the languages of Europe, but think about, this is all Ottoman Empire, right? And Russia definitely wants this area, right? So Russia's going to be meddling in the Balkans. They want this, and so do all the other. So do all the other European countries. Like, they want the Middle East, and they're going to want it even more when they discover oil there, which isn't until the early 1900s. But that is going to be a theme. Okay, so in terms of, and I'm going to try and do this quickly, and maybe I will just kind of highlight the things that I really think you need to know about the other isms. Okay. So, radicalism in England. We refer to radicalism in England. As you read the rest of the chapter, you will need to look at radicalism in England. We've talked about utilitarianism. Okay, on the continent, radicalism. So, meaning that utilitarianism is kind of like a special English form of radicalism. Okay. And on the continent, we know that radicalism was republicanism. They held as their model the French Republic of 1793, interestingly, after they had killed the king, right, and right before the Terror. Okay, so they look forward to further revolutions. They're all about secret societies, and they're opposed to the church and opposed to any form of monarchy. They're members of the intelligentsia, the educated elite. And so Republicans on the continent, in France especially, there are going to be lots of Republicans. In Germany, there are going to be some, but as the further east you go, there are going to be fewer and fewer. Socialists, like socialism, as we'll continue to talk about, obviously we will know that it's going to focus on the injustices of the economic system, and they are going to see private enterprise and capitalistic competition as kind of these bad things for society, right? They're going to see the Industrial Revolution as like this competition between capitalists is making people suffer, right? But there's distinct differences between the utopian socialists like Robert Owen, this guy over here, Robert Owen, and his counterparts in France, Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier. All these guys are going to be the utopian socialists. They think they can remove themselves from society and create these model communities with high wages, good education, and they never work, right? Like Brook Farms there's the New Harmony in Indiana and one other called Brook Farms in the United States, and then the Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier in France. It's interesting. They argue for a planned society with public ownership of industrial equipment, but under the control of the great captains of industry and engineers. So this could be called a technocracy. Okay, so if we're gonna like talk about that, technocracy, a government or control of society or industry by an elite of technical experts. So Saint-Simon and Fourier talk about technocracy. We can also call this perhaps a form of corporatism. And corporatism, which we will get to later, but corporatism is kind of a marriage between the state and leaders of industry, captains of industry, and engineers. It's all in the name of social improvement, though, for the utopian socialists. Okay, but this is all pre-Marx. Marx won't make his appearance until 1848. Okay, but one of the most important guys to come out of France, out of this kind of socialist atmosphere pre-Marx, is Louis Blanc. Okay, and Louis Blanc. Let's get a picture of Louis Blanc. He will factor into here's Louis Blanc. He will factor into the revolutions in France before Marx makes his appearance. But there's a big difference between utopian socialism and the early socialists and what Marx will call scientific socialism, which dominates the latter half of the 19th century. Okay, but Louis Blanc comes up with the idea of social workshops, and he becomes kind of a spokesman for the increasingly radicalized workers of France. Remember how I talked about the artisans who are displaced by the destruction of the guilds. Okay, so he comes up with this idea of social workshops, and he will listen to the artisans who are displaced. We talked about feminism a little bit. Mary Wollstonecraft, we know. The egalitarian feminists insist that men and women were equal in reason. I mentioned John Stuart Mill already, but that idea of utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, means that you have to include women, right? And his most famous book is in 1869, The Subjection of Women. And one that will factor in, so Flora Tristan, she's a fantastic writer, a fantastic socialist, kind of feminist, and she's one of my favorites. You will read something by her. George Sand as well, who's a woman but dresses like a man. So feminism is mixed in with socialism and utilitarianism and republicanism. Okay, not so much liberalism, because liberals kind of believe like, well, if women are going to get any rights, then the government's going to have to intervene. So we don't want the government to intervene. But yeah. Okay, so nationalism. To the final point. We've talked about this a little bit, but this is going to be my final point. Look at all the different languages that we have here. Okay, so we've got Dutch, Flemish, French, Basque, Catalan, German, Czech, Polish, Belarusian. I mean, this is going to be a problem here, because if you're thinking about nationalism and the ideas that, like, in states, if you want to build a state, you have to, and if you consider yourself a nation, for example, if you're Serb, and you consider yourself like ethnically and culturally different, and you want your own nation, you're going to think of yourself as having a different history. The Italians are going to think of themselves as having a different history, but even at this time, everybody's speaking Italian. Like, you have the same language, you have the same history, you have the same culture, you have the same traditions, but these, this is like Piedmont, Sardinia. Like, if I was to juxtapose this, map, right, with, I don't know, let's go to the AP Euro maps on my desktop, right, and Euro map from 1815, right, Congress of Vienna. Let's go for a Congress of Vienna one. Here we go, Europe 1815, okay. I mean, you got Savoy, Lombardy. This is Austrian, controlled by Austrians. These are like little papal states, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Piedmont, Sardinia. But all these people speak Italian, right? So they consider themselves a nation. But language is a huge part of uniting people. You have to have a set of similar cultural beliefs as well. It helps to have the same religion. It helps to have the same history or view of your own history, right? So Poland, Spain. I mean, this is what Herder's talking about in Germany. Herder will talk about this in terms of the Volkgeist, right? So nationalism and mixed with patriotism starts to become a threat to the established order, because if you're let's juxtapose that again. If you're the Austrian Empire, like, think about Austria being right here, right? Okay, so let's look at Austria. Look at Austria. I mean, like, now imagine here. We're gonna move this over here. I'm gonna move this kind of over here. So here's Austria, and here's Austria on the other map. I mean, you got Magyar, Slovak, Slovene, Croatian, Czech, Polish, German, all in the same empire. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Not going to work. You're going to have to use kind of force or political co-optation to keep those people in line, and over time it's just not going to work. So that's something that we're going to have to track. So you should know about Mazzini in Italy. You should know about Young Italy and the Carbonari. You should know about, obviously, Herder and Fichte and Hegel. And Hegel's big for nationalism because he argues that the state was the guarantor of freedom, order, and the embodiment of reason. And so he kind of says that the state in the future will be the actor that will partake in the dialectic, so that Hegel argues that, like, the German nation, the German state will impose its own thesis on other antithesis, right? Okay, so kind of taking nations and putting them into the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, okay? We have in economics, okay, in terms of, like, nationalism, List, I think it's Friedrich List. I could be wrong. I think it is, but Friedrich, is it Friedrich? It's Friedrich. Friedrich List, okay, writes The National System of Political Economy, 1840, okay, and he's important because he says that each nation must consider what economic theory suits it best. He supports high tariffs, opposing free trade, and he kind of says that Germany, especially, ought to develop its own industries. So he's a kind of reaction against liberal free trade, because he says that free trade works best for England, right? And what works best for England doesn't necessarily work best for everybody. And then you should also know the differences between nationalism in the West and nationalism in the East, because in Eastern Europe, as we know, there's going to be more, as we go east, it's going to be more empire. We got the Austrian Empire, we got the Russian Empire, we got the Ottoman Empire, we got Prussia, which is going to become the German Empire by 1870. So in people in the East, especially if they think of themselves as politically different, as independent nations, they're going to need to rise up against these empires, okay? And one of the first peoples that will do that are the Greeks. The Greeks, and you can talk to Mr. G about this, but the Greeks will rise up against the Ottoman Empire, and they're one of the first nationalist movements. Also, hidden behind this little map here is Ireland. Ireland is going to be another first wave nationalist movement. Hungary is going to get involved. Poland is going to get involved, but we're going to talk about that. You should know about the Slavic revival and Slavophilism, kind of the idea of a pan-Slavic movement, that all Slavic peoples should kind of be under one roof. This is especially important to Russian people. Russians will start to say, "Well, we're Slavic, and so we should run the campaigns for all Slavs, right? We should be the spokesman for all Slavic people." Okay, so I'm almost done. Okay, okay, so now to the what am I trying to say? I'm sorry, I'm running out of steam here. Now to the hint for the DBQ. The hint for the DBQ is that you all, in your reading this weekend, should focus on England. Focus on England in the readings as you're finishing up chapter 11. Focus on what's happening in England, the radicalism of England, the reform attempts in England. Okay, focus on England if you want to do especially well on that DBQ test. Okay, so that is the hint. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. Okay, thanks, guys.